You think you know the map of human possibility. Neat lines drawn between what we can explain and what we call myth, a tidy history built from dates, bones, and broken pottery. You imagine ancient people as familiar figures, farmers, traders, temple builders, bound by the limits of their tools and the sky they could see. But what if those limits are only the edges of the stories we were taught? What if, tucked away in soil and stone, in coastlines kissed by fog and deserts that sing in heat, there are traces that refuse to fit our neat categories? Objects that suggest voyages that should not have been possible, skeletons that make us question the scale of the bodies we expect to find, technologies that seem to predate the science that would be needed to make them? Today, we stand at the threshold of those contradictions, and the threshold is more than a curiosity, it is an invitation. Over the next 2 hours, over the next pages, we will walk through forgotten harbors, descend into submerged chambers, examine peculiar graves, and follow trade routes that archaeology only half believes. We will meet inscriptions that puzzle linguists, metals that defy expected alloys, and alignments of stones so precise they force astronomers to squint. We will not pretend every mystery is supernatural, nor will we slap easy explanations onto phenomena that stubbornly refuse them. Instead, we will balance careful evidence with wholehearted wonder, entertain competing hypotheses with the rigor they deserve, and leave room for the uncomfortable thrill you feel when the ground under your assumptions starts to shift. Picture yourself at the edge of a dig site as dawn creeps over the horizon, fog clinging to the fields like a secret that refuses to be told. Picture the crunch of gravel, the archaeologist's lamp, the hush as a trowel reveals the curve of bone. That hush is our starting point. We promise big revelations, things that make you ask whether our history is a single, clean stream or a braided river of lost currents. And we promise to leave questions open, because sometimes the most honest answer is, we still don't know. So take a breath. Imagine the world as a palimpsest, layers scraped and written over, and prepare to read the places where the newer ink failed to cover the older truth. The first place I want you to picture is not a temple or a palace but a narrow strip of coastline where blue meets gray and fishermen still tell stories of wooden hulks that appear and vanish like ghosts. Here, beneath the shifting sand of a bay, lie timbers and stonework that resist the calendar. One-sentence teaser. At the mouth of a seemingly ordinary estuary, an engineered harbor complex reveals maritime sophistication far older than previously believed. The harbor's foundations have been dated, using multiple methods, radiocarbons supplemented by optically stimulated luminescence, into a span of centuries that sits stubbornly earlier than the era we credit with organized long-distance sea trade in that region. Precise tests point toward a maritime installation built between 2400 and 2200 BC, a time that places its artisans alongside early city-states rather than the seafaring empires that followed. The scale is staggering. Breakwaters of worked stone extend in arcs for hundreds of meters, and mooring stones, none native to the immediate shoreline, tell of boats large enough to need heavy anchors. Artifacts recovered from the silt, carved wooden fittings, copper fastenings with an alloy composition uncharacteristic for local metallurgy, and pottery bearing an unfamiliar geometric motif, suggest a workshop producing goods for trade, not mere subsistence fishing. Pull up the maps, and you see this estuary sits at a convergence of known prehistoric trade routes, yet the construction techniques, interlocking stones smoothed with abrasives and sealed with a resinous mortar, are strikingly advanced for their epoch. Now, let's be fair, sediment can be complicated, and coastlines move. Some skeptics point to later reuse or contamination, arguing that wave action and storms can bury more recent construction under older sediments. Still, for all the evidence, the harbor's foundations sit under layers that, when carefully sampled, belong to earlier strata. But here's where it gets tricky. The copper alloy we dated is not the simple bronze of that period. Trace element analysis reveals a high nickel content more typical of later metallurgical practice, or of ores from a distant source. The simplest answer, that trade brought exotic, or, opens another question: who controlled those networks so early? And how did their shipwrights engineer a harbor that anticipates later port design? Some scholars propose a lost maritime culture, a coastal polity whose records did not survive the tides. Others suggest episodic colonization by enterprising merchant communities from well beyond the horizon. There are even less orthodox ideas that seafaring technologies developed independently in unusually resource-rich pockets. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, the tang of salt in the air, a carved mooring stone half buried at your feet, the ghost of a shipyard's hammering in your ears. Consider the human side, men and women balancing risks on fragile vessels, bringing copper and crafted goods to a settlement that invested time and labor into infrastructure beyond its immediate needs. We still don't know whether this harbor belonged to an empire of sailors or to a small, brilliant community whose innovations were swallowed by the sea and time. Move inland in imagination to a high plateau rimmed with winds that seem to comb the bones of the earth. There, a series of stone structures align with a precision that engineers dream of. One-sentence teaser. At this plateau, a ring of megaliths maps not just the sky but an ancient, calibrated astronomical observatory. Historical context matters. The site sits within a cultural horizon dated to approximately 1200 to 900 BC, a period of shifting polities and expanding ritual practices. Measurements of the stones, monoliths weighing as much as 30 tons, quarried from a ridge more than 20 kilometers away, suggest movement by an organized workforce and knowledge of hauling techniques. The stone's placement corresponds strikingly with the solar and lunar cycles. Particular slabs frame the points of solstice sunrise and certain lunar standstills with a precision that confounded the first surveyors. Excavations near the stones have yielded pottery fragments, burnt offerings, and charred grains, hinting at ritual feasts timed to celestial events. The discovery of an engraved disc, an oddly thin metal plate inlaid with symbols that some linguists initially linked to proto-writing, adds another layer. Markings indicate not only dates but perhaps a method of tracking longer cycles, like an early lunisolar calendar. Competing theories unfold. Some archaeologists argue this is an astronomical shrine used by a priestly elite to legitimize rulership, aligning harvest cycles with political power. Others propose a practical calendrical role, assisting agricultural planning in marginal environments. A darker hypothesis suggests the site served as a social regulator. Ceremonies around predictable celestial events strengthen networks across scattered settlements. But here's where it gets tricky. The engineering precision implies an understanding of precession and long-term celestial drift, knowledge we attribute to later astronomers. Could a society at this marginal plateau have developed generational observational practices sophisticated enough to record changes over centuries and calibrate monuments accordingly? Maybe. Another possibility: later refurbishment that masked earlier intentions. Ancient communities often reused sacred locales, shifting purposes with time. Still, for all the evidence, the megaliths placements create sightlines that work with mathematical regularity, not accident. Picture yourself at dawn, wind cutting across the plateau, the sun's first tooth appearing between two slabs as smoke from a ritual pile curls upward. Imagine the cohesion such a spectacle would give a dispersed population. We still don't know whether this was science, ritual, or both, and whether those who set the stones knew more about the heavens than their descendants recorded. Now consider a river valley where the bedrock holds a secret. A tunnel system, long thought natural, reveals chisel marks and construction choices that could only have been made with tools and techniques far beyond the capacity we expected for the supposed period of its construction. One-sentence teaser. Beneath a once fertile valley, cut stone galleries extend for kilometers, hinting at engineering solutions that predate known infrastructure of their type. The gallery's walls present tool marks consistent with bronze and copper implements, but layered within are thin striations whose microstructure suggests abrasives and techniques that modern metallography struggles to explain for the assigned age of 3000 to 2500 BC. Measurements show galleries maintaining consistent gradient and curvature for effective drainage, including chambers cut to trap silt and facilitate maintenance. Nearby artifacts, ceramic lamp fragments, oil residues, and a surprising cache of semi-precious beads, point to a society that invested in large-scale public works. Was this irrigation conceived to serve a major urban center long since lost? Or was this an innovative attempt by a smaller culture to survive climatic stress? Now, let's be fair, caves and karst formations sometimes mimic man-made galleries, and ancient populations often used natural features and modified them. But careful petrographic studies found mortar compositions and chisel patterns aligning with intentional construction across several connected cavities, and radiocarbon samples from charcoal embedded in sealing materials return dates that cluster tightly within a historically contentious window. Some geologists suggest later intrusion or reworking may have introduced materials that confuse dating. Still, for all that, the gallery's engineering, graded slopes, sluice-like channels, even rudimentary gates, speaks to planned water management on a scale unexpected for the era. Competing hypotheses widen the field: an administrative center lost to flood or earthquake, a ritual complex where subterranean passage symbolized a journey, or an early attempt at climate adaptation, where ancient engineers moved water to survive prolonged drought. Imagine yourself crouched under an arch, a small lamp warming your hands as you cup the echo of footsteps, feeling the cool breath of the earth. Think about the labor: hundreds, perhaps thousands, pulling stones, shaping channels, planning gradients. We still don't know where the administrative hubs were, who ordered the work, or why the records, if any existed, failed to survive. Travel with me now to a desert expanse where wind-blown sand has both preserved and concealed objects that seem to mock our definitions of plausible metallurgy. One-sentence teaser: scattered across dunes, objects of an unknown alloy and tooling suggest technological experimentation that complicates the linear story of metallurgical progress. These artifacts, small, handled devices, a few inscribed plaques, and composite fragments that look like machine parts, show microstructures inconsistent with simple smelting. Metallurgical analysis returned an alloy matrix with a mix of copper, tin, and trace elements such as vanadium and cobalt, in proportions that do not match known ore deposits of the period. Moreover, the smoothing on some surfaces hints at polishing by materials whose residue contains microplastics, an impossibility by strict chronology, though contamination cannot be immediately ruled out. Excavators applied rigorous contamination protocols. Still, the residues prompted heated debate. Ceramic molds nearby indicate casting techniques, yet the components' thinness and uniformity imply controlled casting conditions, a furnace with consistent temperature regulation, a knowledge of alloying, and perhaps even a lost technique of quenching and tempering. Now, the sober explanations arrive quickly. Trade could have brought exotic ores, later contamination could have cheated the samples, and modern intrusions are always a danger in exposed landscapes. Now, let's be fair, the desert is a highway. Ancient traders and modern explorers alike crossed it. But for all the evidence, the fragment's patina sits in sediment layers consistent with early burial, and their context, when painstakingly recorded, resists a modern intrusion hypothesis. Competing theories range from a localized technological bloom, an isolated culture that developed a metallurgical niche, to the tantalizing idea of itinerant craftsmen who carry techniques across continents. There are also mythic overlays, stories of smith gods, and giants who forge tools beyond mortal ken. Picture yourself brushing sand from a thin, curved plate, the sun making the alloy wink as if it remembered fire. Consider the human drive to tinker, the same impulse that would one day produce engines and satellites, but here expressed in palm-sized objects that refuse easy classification. We still don't know whether these were functional, ceremonial, or experimental, nor whether their makers intended them for utility or simply as status objects that marked someone's exceptional skill. Beneath the waves, off a coastline most maps ignore, lie chambers filled with inscriptions that push linguists to the edge of the known. One-sentence teaser: submerged stone rooms, their walls etched in a script that shares traces with several early writing systems yet aligns perfectly with none. The chambers sit in a drowned landscape dated to roughly 10,000 to 8,000 BC, an epoch when many of our comfortable histories place humans in small, mobile bands, not erecting inscribed architecture. The inscriptions themselves are remarkable, repeated symbols that suggest a syntactic structure, markings that might encode numerals or calendrical data, and pictographs showing stylized sea creatures and boats. Petrographic analysis of the stones shows weathering consistent with long submersion, and microfossils embedded in mortar indicate rapid inundation, possibly a result of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Now, the hypotheses scatter. Some scholars argue for a later construction that was moved and submerged by unique geological events, a rare but not impossible chain of earthquakes and transgressions. Others, more radical, suggest that advanced, sedentary coastal communities experimented with proto-writing far earlier than conventionalists accept, perhaps as a response to complex maritime economies. Again, skeptics point to pareidolia, a human tendency to see order in chaos. Pattern seeking is a powerful tool but a dangerous one. The human mind can weave syntax from random marks. Still, for all the evidence, the inscriptions exhibit repetition and hierarchical structuring that resist accidental origin. Imagine yourself treading water above the chambers, the light filtering into the stone rooms like an otherworldly cathedral, the etched lines catching sunlight that has traveled through millennia of tide. Think of the practicalities. A populace coordinating fishing, trade, and ritual across a coastline subject to dramatic environmental change might invent ways to store and transmit information earlier than we suppose. We still don't know whether these marks are a true script, a proto-notational system, or the idiosyncratic graffiti of an inspired few. In a valley dotted with barrows and low mounds, a grave deposit disrupts our assumptions about human anatomy and social memory. One-sentence teaser. A burial site yields skeletal remains of extraordinary dimensions and grave goods that imply a social status usually reserved for mythic figures. Giants, perhaps, or an unusual genetic population. The largest femur recovered is almost twice the length of regional averages, and a skull exhibits cranial sutures and proportions outside the normal human range. Radiometric dating places the burial complex in the late Neolithic, roughly 3500 to 3000 BC, contemporaneous with many established farming communities. Grave goods, bronze ornaments, high-quality textiles preserved in the anaerobic soil, and a necklace of imported shells point to trade and prestige. Now, caution is paramount. Skeletal distortion can result from taphonomic processes. Burial in cramped spaces and subsequent soil pressure can change bone appearance. For all that, osteologists who reassembled the skeletons report articulation and proportionality consistent across multiple individuals, tall statures, robust limb bones, and dental patterns suggesting a shared diet and community. Genetic testing, where possible, shows markers overlapping with known populations but with allele frequencies that skew the sample toward taller statures. Competing theories include the relatively conservative, perhaps a population with a genetic predisposition for height, such as you find in certain pastoralist groups. Others, more speculative, point to a genetic mutation or selection for height in a community where tallness signaled leadership or adaptation to particular labor. The mythic explanation, giants from oral traditions, remains just that, myth, but myth often contains kernels of social memory that merit study. Picture yourself standing among the mounds at twilight, the outline of a femur larger than a man's shoulder blade leaning in the dirt like a tree limb, and imagine how such bodies would shape stories and social expectations. We still don't know whether these were simply tall people in a specific environment, a genetic outlier community, or something that challenges our assumptions about human variability. The final scene for now takes us to a ruined workshop on the edge of a canyon, where artisans once shaped glass with colors and clarity that should not have been possible for their time. One-sentence teaser. A kiln complex contains glass artifacts of remarkable chemical purity and optical properties, suggesting techniques of vitrification and annealing far ahead of their supposed age. Chemical analysis shows unusually low levels of impurities and bubbles, a stable matrix composition, and coloring achieved without the nod to later known fluxes and stabilizers. Datable residues in the kiln's hearths point to a construction and use phase within a window scholars associate with modest pottery production, not the highly controlled processes required for fine glass. So, what do we make of it? Perhaps itinerant glassworkers traveled, carrying recipes and expertise. Or maybe isolated technological advances rose where circumstances favored experimentation, abundant fuel, trade access to particular sand types, and a social setting that valued decorative and functional glass. There are also less technological hypotheses: ceremonial vitrification where heat and sand were used symbolically, and the artifacts were produced not as durable utility objects but as ritual effigies. Picture a craftsman with a long pipe, breath shaping molten clarity, the canyon walls catching the light as the glass cools into an object that glows like a captured sunrise. Think about the transmission of craft. An idea survives because others adopt and adapt it. We still don't know whether these pieces are evidence of a lost tradition of craft transmission or isolated sparks of brilliance that never caught fire. We began this long walk with a promise to balance wonder and skepticism, to let the human stories breathe between dates and essays, and to leave certain questions open. These 6 vignettes already complicate the tidy model of human progress as a straight line. They ask us to imagine networks of trade, of ideas, of people, moving in ways our textbooks have only just begun to register. They push us to consider environmental pressures, social incentives, and the sheer stubbornness of human curiosity. As you imagine these places, the harbor shrouded in morning mist, the plateau counting stars, the subterranean galleries, the desert smith's fragments, the submerged rooms with etched walls, the barrows of the tall, and the glass glowing in a canyon kiln, notice how similar impulses appear in each: a drive to manipulate environment, to make sense of sky and sea, to mark memory in durable matter. We still don't know all the pieces, but we can trace the fingerprints. And tracing them changes not only our calendar of innovation but also our sense of proximity. How close were ancient communities to one another in idea as well as geography? Were there nodes of exchange, cities, ports, caravans, that transmitted innovation across vast distances? Or did parallel, convergent inventions arise independently, pushed by similar pressures in different places? The answers will matter for more than history. They shape how we think about human resilience, about the adaptations communities can make under climatic stress, and about the lost capacities we might recover if we simply pay attention to the fragments the past leaves behind. One more place to slow down and look closely is a small, plastered chamber discovered beneath a temple terrace, the kind of cramped, dust-choked space that feels like a reluctance of the past to reveal itself. One-sentence teaser: inside a shallow pottery-lined pit, a device of copper and clay hints that ancient hands may have toyed with electricity long before we expected. The find is deceptively simple: a ceramic jar, stained with acidic residues, cradling a rolled copper sheet around an iron rod, sealed with bitumen. At first glance, it is the sort of object a cautious textbook might dismiss as votive, a symbolic container used in ritual depositions. But chemical assays complicate that neat dismissal. The residues include traces of citric and acetic acids, compounds easily available in ancient households, lemon, grape, fermentations, compounds that, when combined with an iron-copper pair, can generate a small electrochemical cell. Measurements made by modern scientists, replicating the jar exactly with period-accurate materials, produced small but measurable voltages, enough to drive a low-current electroplating demonstration under controlled conditions. The implication is immediate and intoxicating: a possible source of electricity, perhaps used to electroplate a thin layer of gold onto copper, to produce a gilded appearance without the laborious hammering known from other methods. Historical context tightens and loosens at once. The object comes from a city layer dated to the late Hellenistic period, though similar jars have been found in other near-contemporary contexts across a broad arc of civilization. If used intentionally for electroplating, this technique would be an ingenious shortcut, an artisan's trick to create brilliant surfaces. Critics push back. Corrosion, for instance, can mimic the appearance of plating. Compounds in the soil or purposeful later contamination could generate similar residues. And small voltages do not equate to large-scale technology. A single jar can create a novelty effect, but scaling that to consistent manufacturing demands infrastructure and repeated knowledge transmission. Still, for all the evidence, the jar's recurrence in workshop contexts, sometimes paired with small gilded artifacts whose composition suggests surface deposition rather than solid gold, keeps the debate alive. Some scholars propose the jars were practical tools used by jewelers, others that they were experimental curiosities created by individuals tinkering between craft and chemistry, and a few more speculative voices whisper of ritual symbolism masking practical application, an object that both glittered and signified divine favor because it could be made to shine. Picture yourself kneeling in a dim atelier, the air smelling of coal and resin, A young smith dipping a gilded amulet into a jar, then lifting it to the light. Imagine the gleam that must have seemed like a small miracle. Think about what it tells us about ancient ingenuity, a willingness to blend observation, household chemistry, and artisan skill into something both useful and wondrous. We still don't know whether these are the relics of a proto-industrial technique, isolated experiments, or symbolic devices whose electrical properties were incidental to their purpose. Not far from that city's trade lanes, on a plateau where the wind presses thin against the cheek of the land, archaeologists uncovered a ribbon of pavement, an engineered roadbed cut into bedrock, flanked by channels that suggest planned drainage and where patterns inconsistent with sporadic foot traffic. One-sentence teaser. A paved route worn by regular passage suggests an organized corridor of movement far older and more sophisticated than expected for the region. The stones are mortared in places with a lime-rich binder whose composition resembles coastal mixes, though the nearest shoreline now sits many kilometers away. A reminder that landscapes change and that social networks often adjust to those changes by turning to hard infrastructure. The road averages over 3 meters in width, broad enough for animals or carts, and periodic stone markers, subtle steely carved with civic symbols, appear at intervals that would make sense for regulated tolls or caravan staging areas. Organic remains in roadside middens, charred grain, fish bones, and fragments of imported amphorae hint at sustained traffic and a supply chain that moved not just goods but also ideas. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal and compacted roadside fills cluster in a period that predates widespread wheel use in the highlands, raising immediate questions. Were wheeled vehicles part of this corridor? Or did sustained pack traffic produce the same wear? Did the road connect competing polities? Or was it a conduit for a single polity asserting control over resources and labor? Now, let's be fair. Linear wear can sometimes be misread. Repeated foot traffic by many people over generations can produce the same smoothness as wheeled passage. Yet, for all the evidence, the geometry and construction efforts suggest intentional design beyond a local path, surveyed, graded, and maintained. Competing theories include a nascent state projecting power across a newly integrated hinterland, itinerant traders establishing regular routes that later became formalized, or ritual marchways connecting sacred centers in regular procession. The mythic overlay is irresistibly cinematic, images of long columns of camel-borne caravans, drums echoing through ravines, and the sun rising over a line of banners. Picture yourself walking the beaten stones at dawn, the cool of the air cradling the dust beneath your sandals, imagining the hundreds of journeys those stones have hosted. Consider how such a road reshaped social life, markets cluster, communication speed, and cultural forms, stories, inventions, religions, ride the same planks as pottery. We still don't know who commissioned this corridor, whether it was built for commerce, ritual, or conquest, or how knowledge of road building itself spread into these lands. Crossing the globe in thought, let us visit a valley where a series of low, circular terraces step down toward a river like the shallow teeth of a comb. One-sentence teaser. Terraces and sediment traps suggest a sophisticated ancient hydraulic landscape engineered to farm on a grand scale in a marginal environment. The terraces are not random. Each holds stratified deposits containing seeds, pollen, and microfossils that reconstruct an agricultural program of surprising diversity. Legumes, millet, and an old-world grain variety whose genetic relatives are rare today. Channels link terraces to reservoirs, and sluices controlled by stone gates imply an understanding of water management that counters the assumption of merely simple, surface-level agriculture. Pottery shards found in house foundations show decorative motifs shared across a broad region, suggesting cultural connectivity or long-distance exchange. Here's where it gets tricky. Climate reconstructions show periodic droughts and flooding during the era in question, suggesting that hydraulic investment might have been an adaptation to volatile weather, a communal response to risk. Now, the hypotheses range from centralized planning, a proto-state marshalling labor to build storage and distribution networks, to decentralized cooperation among households pooling resources for mutual survival. And of course, there are those who read such engineering as the groundwork for later urbanization, a set of practices that, once in place, allowed population densities to rise and social complexity to follow. Picture yourself standing on a terrace at sunset, the river glowing like a ribbon of oil far below, and imagine the rhythm of a community working together to shift water, seed, and harvest in time with seasons. Think about the human story. Such projects bind people together, create obligations, hierarchies, and shared memories. We still don't know how the social contracts that supported such engineering were negotiated, who decided, and how they punished or rewarded compliance. Beneath a different sky, along a shoreline pounded by waves that carry both driftwood and stories, a set of wooden coffins emerge from anoxic peat. Coffins whose construction mirrors maritime traditions but whose occupants challenge our comfortable categories. One-sentence teaser. Waterlogged burials preserve fragile artifacts and bodies in ways that rewrite assumptions about social stratification and maritime culture. The peat-preserved woven textiles, painted shields, and the remains of food offerings, fish, boiled tubers, and plant perfumes, evoking rituals of considerable investment. But among these goods were beads of a glass composition that, according to elemental analysis, was produced with a level of purity and isotopic signature more commonly associated with Mediterranean sands. How did such objects travel so far inland, to a place where coastal trade seems improbable? Was this the result of direct contact, down-the-line exchange, or a later intrusive deposition? The social implications are immediate. Certain individuals were buried with significant accoutrements, suggesting status differentiation tied to seafaring expertise or long-distance connections. DNA recovered from the remains hints at a mixed ancestry, local foragers intertwined with incoming maritime lineages, their children inheriting both skill sets. Now, let us be fair. Waterlogged contexts can attract objects from other layers, and peat can shift items through bioturbation. Still, for all the evidence, the burial's contexts are consistent and repeatedly show similar composition across multiple interments. Competing theories include direct maritime colonization, seasonal marriages between coastal traders and inland groups, or the role of high-status itinerant merchants who embedded themselves within local communities. Picture yourself leaning over a coffin, the peat releasing the smell of iron and plant oils, imagining the life of a mariner who spent seasons away and returned bearing strange treasures as proof of broader horizons. Think about the cultural impact. Even a trickle of foreign goods can alter local aesthetics, social ambition, and ritual display. We still don't know how frequent these contacts were, whether they reoriented local economies, or how the people themselves narrated these exchanges. In the shadow of a ruined palace, a cache of images carved into soft limestone complicates our model of symbolic communication. One-sentence teaser. Carved panels show a sequence of images that some argue represents a narrative writing system, pictures arranged in a syntax, rather than mere iconography. The sequence depicts a ship, a figure reaching with an offering, a creature that may be a stylized feline, and finally an object resembling a disc or star. The pattern repeats in varying combinations across panels, sometimes reversed or nested within other motifs, suggesting rules for assembly. Dating the panels places them in an era when fully developed scripts were known in neighboring regions, but the panel's signs do not match any known corpus. Philologists debate whether this is a form of mnemonic pictography, a memory aid for oral recitation, or a true written system encoding language. Now, let's be fair, pictures can be decorative and arbitrary. But for all the evidence, repetition, positional syntax, and ritual contexts, panels positioned in storerooms and near archives hint at a more developed semiotic system. Competing theories include a localized scribal tradition experimenting with notation, an elite code used for ceremony and restricted knowledge, or a borrowing and transformation of neighboring scripts into something idiosyncratic. Picture yourself tracing the grooves of the limestone with your fingertips, imagining priests or merchants arranging tokens to recall long voyages and exchanges. Think about the social implications. If more communities than we admit develop systems to fix memory in durable forms, our timelines for administrative and literary complexity may need to be broadened. We still don't know whether this is a full script that encoded speech, a series of ritual mnemonics, or a transitional form lost between oral and written worlds. Finally, before we begin to draw these threads together, Consider the many places where myth and material intersect so closely that disentangling them feels like trying to separate threads in a braided rope. We find altars that match the language of local legends almost word for word, artifacts that people still point to when telling a story about a forebear who knew the sea, and geometries and town plans that echo cosmological myths. One-sentence teaser: across disparate landscapes, mythic narratives correspond to physical features in ways that suggest oral memory can preserve complex information over millennia. Oral traditions often get dismissed as mutable and unreliable, but when a legend about a flooded coastal plain corresponds to a buried estuary dated to a specific period, or when a folk narrative about a stone that points to the sun matches an ancient sightline, the case for resilience in oral transmission becomes persuasive. Now, skeptics are quick to point out coincidence and the human appetite for pattern. Myths are adaptive tools; they can be reshaped to fit new realities. Still, for all the evidence, clusters of correlations keep emerging, stories that describe not just events but agricultural calendars, territorial boundaries, and even specific navigational cues like currents and reefs. Consider the human need to teach. Before writing became widespread, stories encoded survival knowledge. Picture yourself sitting by a hearth, an elder tracing a coastline on a scrap of bark as a circle of attentive children listen to the cadence of names that map hazard and harbor alike. Think about how such narratives could act as oral topography, a living map that keeps a community safe and prosperous. We still don't know precisely how faithful oral transmission can remain over centuries, nor whether mythic overlays sometimes obscure rather than preserve specific technical knowledge, but the persistence is real and consequential. Now, having wandered through harbors, megaliths, subterranean galleries, desert forges, submerged rooms, barrows of the unusually tall, glowing glass, jars that might have held sparks, paved arteries of trade, terraces of flowing water, waterlogged coffins, carved narrative panels, and the braided seam of myth and material, we start to see a pattern, not a single answer, but a web. These mysteries tug at our understanding of human innovation, of how knowledge transfers across time and space, and of how environmental pressures can catalyze genius in the small and the big. They remind us that the archaeological record is a conversation with silence. Some things speak loudly, others whisper. Many are lost completely until luck, climate, or persistent curiosity brings them back to light. If these finds share anything, it is the human impulse to press against limits, to cross seas, to move stones, to shape light and metal and words into things that carry meaning beyond immediate survival. That impulse binds a harbor builder with a smith and with a storyteller. It ties a terrace maker to a road layer and to a teacher on a winter night. We still don't know all the answers, but perhaps we were never meant to. The point is not always to finish the story but to keep listening to the fragments, to test them, to argue about them sharply and honestly, and to let them expand our sense of who we were and who we might become. Beneath a low, rolling hill that locals still call the humming place, because, on certain nights, a muted vibration rises from the earth like a hell breath, archaeologists uncovered a lattice of metal and ceramic that changes everything we thought we knew about ancient material networks. One-sentence teaser: under a hillfolk name that sounds like superstition, a woven lattice of metal rods and fired clay hints at a proto-distribution system, perhaps an attempt to channel energy, stabilize structures, or transmit signals across short distances. The context here is stubbornly ambiguous. The deposits sit within a cultural layer radiocarbon dated to roughly 900 to 600 BC, a period of expanding craft specialization and long-distance exchange in that region. The lattice itself is astonishing in its composition. Copper rods, some corroded into crystalline patterns, are bound at regular intervals by ceramic insulators shaped like small beads, their glaze containing mineral inclusions uncommon to local kilns. The geometry is no accident. Rods intersect at right angles forming grids that mirror small-scale engineering plans. Embedded within certain junctions were small quartz pebbles and thin sheets of a metal alloy whose corrosion patina suggests an intentional mixture of copper and another element that resists simple bronze categorization. We found nodes, chambers where the rods converge beside clay-lined pits, and in those nodes residues of organic acids and plant extracts that, when tested by modern experimental archaeologists, can act as electrolytes under the right conditions. But here's where it gets tricky. Do we call this a form of electrical experimentation, an attempt to stabilize or earthenly ground structures, or something entirely symbolic? The simplest, most conservative reading sees a framework for insulating sacred space, an in-place boundary whose physicality served ritual ends, the metal a visible, resonant marker that hums when wind and weather interact. Another hypothesis suggests a more technical purpose, a local craft tradition experimenting with controlled galvanic effects to color metalwork or to etch decorative surfaces. A third, more speculative line of thought imagines a primitive signaling network, short-range, perhaps, but effective in transmitting sensory cues like clicks or thermal differences across a settlement. The mythic overlay is immediate. Older stories speak of a stone that sings, and a vein of lightning under the hill, as if memory retained a glimpse of something once understood and then lost to language. Picture yourself kneeling beside a convergence of rods as dusk paints the hill violet, a tinny vibration under your palms that might be wind, might be soil settling, might be the faint echo of a past that tuned itself to natural frequencies. Imagine an artisan or priest calibrating a bead, testing the way a quartz pebble glints when the air is charged after a storm. Now, let's be fair, corrosion products, incidental mineral deposits, and later contamination can produce patterns that tempt us into technological narratives. Yet for all the evidence, the ordered geometry, the repeated presence of insulating ceramics, and the residues at nodes argue for intent rather than accident. Think of the human drive at work, curiosity mixed with craft, the same inclination that forges new allies and new songs. We still don't know whether this lattice was a crude technology, a ritual framework, or something between the two, and whether its makers understood the principles they manipulated or simply followed a tradition whose rules they never fully articulated. Follow the coastline in imagination to a cluster of islands whose cliffs hide amphorae and architectural fragments from cultures that should never have met. One-sentence teaser: on windswept isles, material culture from distinct, geographically distant traditions mingles. Pottery with northern motifs beside beads forged from tropical shells, suggesting maritime corridors of exchange previously unimagined. Historically, these isles sit at a crossroads of currents that shift with millennia. Sediment cores indicate episodes of calm seas alternating with violent storms across the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. Excavation terraces revealed small ports worked into coves, quays cut of tightly fit stone, and warehouses. Low, sunlit rooms where amphorae once stood shoulder to shoulder, their residues hinting at resins, oils, and fermented liquids from far-flung regions. The pottery assemblage is a puzzle. Wheel-made wares bearing distinct far northern geometric paintings sit next to hand-built vessels with warm, tropical shell tempering and a clay composition traceable to a coastal zone much further south. Strontium isotope analysis of human remains adds another twist. Locals with childhood signatures matching distant estuaries, and burials with mixed goods that include both local and imported prestige items. But here's where it gets tricky. Were these islands the nodes of robust, intentional trade networks, strategic stops for merchant fleets, or the seasonal camps of itinerant seafaring communities whose movement blurred cultural boundaries? The conservative view posits opportunistic exchange, sailors blown off course, gifts exchanged, and stray objects deposited in unexpected places. A more structured interpretation imagines a chain of island way stations, mariners' rest stops where crews changed, goods were transshipped, and knowledge spread. The mythic explanation threads through sailors' lore, a tradition of island keepers, families who tended caches and offered shelter and knowledge to passing skippers, legends that speak of children of two seas, born of unions between traders and islanders. Picture yourself climbing from cove to cove as gulls overhead carve the wind, opening an amphora whose scent is not of your coast but of a foreign estuary you have never seen, running your hand along a ceramic rim painted in a pattern you would have sworn belonged miles and cultures away. Think about how such places complicate our neat maps of interaction. Even a handful of way stations can funnel ideas, genetics, and technologies across enormous distances. We still don't know whether these islands were hubs of systemic exchange that altered regional trajectories or ephemeral crossroads, whose influence trickled through populations slowly and irregularly. Head inland now to a marshland cut through by channels that curve with purpose and grace, where archaeologists uncovered wooden mechanisms, gear-like composites of wood, bone, and teeth, that suggest mechanical thinking long before heavy metallurgy made durable gears practical. One-sentence teaser. In a soggy, working landscape, craftsmen joined wood, bone, and cord into interlocking mechanisms, possible forerunners of complex machines, challenging the timeline of mechanical invention. The dating is secure. Waterlogged timbers preserve annual growth rings that give us precise felling dates clustered around 700 to 500 BC. The assemblage includes workshops, tool caches, and what appear to be small mills or rotary devices where cords loop around wooden shafts set into bearings lined with bone. The craftsmanship is meticulous. Mortises cut to tolerances, wooden teeth carved to fit counterparts, and lubrication residues preserved in anaerobic contexts, animal fats and plant oils that would have reduced friction. Such mechanisms likely had limited torque compared to later metal gears, but in a hydraulic marsh environment, even modest mechanical advantage could transform labor, lifting floodgates, operating sluices, or powering small saws. Now, the theories divide across practical and conceptual lines. Some suggest these are specialized solutions, ingenious but localized, responding to a marsh economy where water control mattered for survival and productivity. Others propose they are the embryonic forms of mechanical thought that would later scale with iron and bronze to produce true machines. A romantic hypothesis imagines tinkerers who crafted cognitive models of motion, watching interlocking teeth teach conceptual relations that would seed later mechanical insight. The mythic overlay here is quiet but potent. Folk narratives speak of wooden hearts, buried in the marsh that once kept the waters honest, metaphors that may encode inherited knowledge of mechanical practices. Picture yourself in the dim of a marsh workshop, light filtering through reeds as a craftsman watches a shaft turn, the slow, repetitive motion teaching the rhythm of ingenuity. Think about the human consequence. Mechanical thinking externalizes knowledge. Machines become memory devices that do work so people can think about other things. We still don't know whether these wooden contraptions represent scattered ingenuity in response to environment, or a conceptual leap toward mechanical abstraction that later civilizations would adopt and amplify. Travel in thought to a mountain valley split by a river where ancient mineworks open like the ribs of the earth, and the ores extracted there show an alloying knowledge and a distribution pattern that confounds trade models. One-sentence teaser. High in the valley, miners extracted complex ores whose metallurgical fingerprints appear in artifacts hundreds of kilometers away, evidence of a managed, perhaps state-controlled mining and distribution system. Geologists map veins rich in copper, arsenic, and trace gold, and archaeometallurgists analyzing slag and bloomery debris discovered consistent smelting recipes, precise temperatures and controlled reductive atmospheres that produce predictable impurity levels. The scale of extraction is notable. Terraces hewn into slopes, sluices to wash shore, and fortified settlements housing a workforce imply an economy centered on extractive labor. The artifacts bearing this valley's fingerprint, tools, ceremonial blades, and ritual objects, appear across a broad swath of landscape, found in elite burials and humble domestic contexts alike. Now, the competing stories form. Perhaps this valley anchored a polity whose control of metal resources underwrote far-reaching alliances or vassalage. Alternatively, independent merchant groups may have organized extraction and trade along corridors that predated formal states. The darker scenario posits a system of coerced labor, where miners lived under the thumb of an elite who then redistributed wealth to maintain power. Yet another reading sees this as a network of specialist communities, mining guilds who maintained recipes and trade secrets, negotiating access with surrounding social groups. Myth wraps itself around miners, songs about deep mothers and breath of the earth echo in the oral tradition and may preserve social memory about the dangers of extraction and the rituals that bound workers together. Picture yourself winding down a shaft, oil lamp sputtering, hearing the distant tap of pick against ore and imagining the social contracts, debt, communal ritual, protection, that made such labor possible. Think about consequences. access to metal transforms societies, tools become weapons, ornaments signal status, and metallurgy becomes both craft and leverage. We still don't know how ownership and control over these resources were organized, or how knowledge of smelting spread without written treatises to fix recipes across generations. Now imagine a cluster of caves along the cooler, northern coast where artists scratched not only animals and hunters but intricate patterns that bear mathematical relations, fractals, repeated ratios, and geometric progressions, suggesting that aesthetic and mathematical thought intertwined in ways we've overlooked. One-sentence teaser: rock art in sheltered caverns encodes a visual mathematics, proportions and recursions that may have served both ritual and proto-scientific functions. The panel's pigments include mineral black, ochre, and hematite, and careful measurement shows repeated proportional relationships among motifs. Animals reduced in scale by near-constant factors, sequences whose spacing approximates geometric series, and spirals that expand with uncanny regularity. Some scholars see mnemonic devices for counting or astronomical tracking. Others argue for ritual aesthetics where repetition symbolizes cycles of life, seasons, harvests. But here's where it gets tricky. How do we distinguish an intuitive aesthetic from a consciously applied numerical system? The art appears in contexts with hearths, engravings, and offerings, hinting at multimodal meaning. Images were not decoration only but part of collective practice. The conservative stance reads pattern as symbolic, not scientific. A more adventurous view suggests early numeracy expressed visually, a way to teach and recall ratios and sequences before notation. Mythic overlays exist. Legends speak of elders teaching youth the Song of Numbers by tracing spirals on cave floors. Picture yourself kneeling on a cool rock, tracing a spiral with a finger and suddenly seeing how its growth maps the pulses of a drum as well as the march of tides. Think about what it would mean if ancient peoples habitually encoded quantitative relationships in art. Knowledge blooms in different forms, and notation is only one path. We still don't know whether these patterns are proto-mathematical systems, mnemonic art, or layered symbolic language whose numerical regularities were incidental or intentional. We have moved through lattices that hum under hills, island crossroads where currents knit cultures, marsh workshops that spun mechanical thought from wood and bone, valley mines whose ores powered distant economies, and caves where pattern and number may have danced together in a firelit choreography. Each discovery folds into the next, not as neat chapters in a single book but as overlapping palimpsests in a world far more inventive, connected, and experimental than a straight chronology allows. Each site returns us to the same human core. People wrestled with material limits, adapted to environment, and found ways, practical, ritual, aesthetic, to extend their reach. Imagine the artisans, sailors, miners, and storytellers whose daily choices push the boundaries of the possible. Think about how knowledge flows, not only down bright lines of trade and empire but also across quieter, braided currents of craft, ritual, and necessity. Still, as compelling as these fragments are, they resist tidy conclusions. Each possibility invites careful skepticism and bold imagination in equal measure. We still don't know whether these scattered innovations reflect convergent problem-solving across different communities, whether they point to unrecognized regional networks of transmission, or whether pockets of brilliance rose and fell like sparks with little impact beyond their immediate moment. There's a place where the sea gives up a map in the most unlikely way. Sonar surveys of a shallow bay revealed regular geometric hollows on the seabed, rectangular depressions, channels cut with right angles, and alignments that read like the ruins of streets beneath a thin film of silt. One-sentence teaser: beneath silted shallows a submerged plan unfolds, suggesting urban planning and navigational foresight in a coastline drowned by rising waters. The sediment cores around the hollows contain datable material that clusters around a period of dramatic sea level rise at the end of the last glacial retreat, yet the hollows themselves are too regular to be mere erosional features. Diver teams found paving stones, fragmentary walls, and a harbor basin whose mouth aligns with ancient current patterns rather than the coastline that exists today. Pottery styles from the site span a surprising chronological breadth, indicating long-term use rather than a single catastrophic occupation. Now, let's be fair, underwater contexts are messy. Post-depositional processes, marine organisms, and shifting sediments can conspire to make geometry where none was intended. Still, for all the evidence, the patterning here repeats across multiple trenches and is corroborated by in situ carved stones bearing house marks and what might be property delineations. Competing theories consider a specialized settlement of mariners adapting to gradual inundation, or a ritualized coastal town deliberately engineered to interact with tides, where houses and quays were arranged in anticipation of seasonal flooding like a community living with the sea rather than against it. A more speculative idea imagines an early urban center with a sophisticated awareness of hydrodynamics, planning streets and canals not for aesthetics but for drainage and commerce. And if so, the implications ripple outward. We must reconsider how quickly coastal communities could develop complex infrastructure in response to climatic change. Picture yourself floating above this drowned plan, sunlight slicing through green water to illuminate a stone corner, as if an architect's hand still lingered, and imagine the lives lived in rhythm with tidal calendars, boats tied at dawn, market cries muffled by water, household tasks timed to ebb and flow. We still don't know whether this site represents a common coastal response lost to time or an exceptional community that adapted in ways that surprise our neat timelines. In a remote upland valley, where frost turned the grasses silver and the sky is a high, cold blue, a cluster of circular stone basins and flues once used to roast seeds and resins showed chemical residues that speak of ancient pharmaceuticals and complex botanical knowledge. One-sentence teaser. Circular roasting basins preserve traces of composite preparations, early pharmacopoeia, that hint at sophisticated botanical science and transecological knowledge transfer. The residues contain alkaloids and complex tannins whose plant sources span lowland and upland ecotones. Some compounds suggest deliberate extraction and stabilization techniques, use of certain clays to bind and preserve active ingredients, timed heating to release but not destroy volatile compounds, and mixtures that produce slow-release ointments. Now, let's be fair, residue analysis is tricky, molecular fragments degrade, and contamination is always a risk, especially when sites have had later use. Yet for all the evidence, patterns emerge, repeated recipes across basins, textual traces in nearby tablets that some epigraphists read as lists of ingredients, and ethnobotanical parallels in later, oral medical traditions that use similar combinations for wound treatment and respiratory care. Competing explanations range from community-level healthcare practices, midwives and healers compiling empirical pharmacopoeias, to elite-controlled knowledge, guarded in palatial households and dispensed as part of social obligation. A more provocative suggestion is that the basins were part of a systematic experimentation with natural compounds, a proto-laboratory where smell, taste, and careful observation produced reproducible remedies long before formalized pharmacology. Picture yourself leaning over a smoldering basin, the air rich with resin and herb, imagining an apprentice's face lit by the glow as an elder explains the timing and the pinch that changes a mixture from soothing to poisonous. Think about the stakes. In a world without sterile hospitals, such knowledge could mean the difference between a healed limb and a lingering infection. We still don't know how widely such knowledge spread, how standardized recipes were, or whether some of these preparations had social or ritual roles that complicate a straightforward medical interpretation. There exists a clear lake high in a mountainous lens where the bottom is littered with wooden paddles, ceremonial masks, and a unique set of carved wooden boards whose incised patterns correspond to star charts when viewed at certain times of year. One-sentence teaser. Carved wooden boards from a lakeshore ritual complex line up with stellar patterns, suggesting a mobile portable observatory used by itinerant astronomer priests. Dendrochronology gives precise construction dates for these boards, and pollen analysis from the lakebed indicates offerings and hearth smoke concentrated at specific lunar phases, as if events were timed to celestial rhythms. The board's incisions use scales and ratios mirrored in the megalithic plates we examined earlier, and experimental reconstructions show that when aligned and rotated they can cast shadows or reflect light to mark solstices and certain bright stars. Now, let's be fair, pareidolia can seduce, and humans are experts at projecting patterns into marks. Still, for all the evidence, the combination of dendrodated boards, ritual refuse tied to astronomically relevant dates, and the functional possibility of shadow markers creates a convincing case for intentionality. Competing theories propose mobile religious groups who used portable apparatus to anchor ritual time across dispersed communities, or itinerant scientists whose observational work provided standardized calendars used for agriculture and navigation. A romantic variant imagines a guild of skywatchers traveling from valley to valley, teaching, aligning festivals, and offering celestial services in a pre-modern consultancy network. Picture yourself beside the lake as moonrise turns the faces of carved wood silver, a priest tilting a board and watching light slide into a notch that hums with communal significance. Consider how such portable knowledge could knit scattered settlements into a shared cosmos. We still don't know whether this represents a single tradition spread widely or multiple groups independently inventing similar solutions to the universal problem of knowing when to plant and when to sail. Across a dry inland plain, researchers unearthed a scatter of tiny clay cylinders whose internal passages indicate they were not simple beads but tuned resonators, perhaps early wind instruments or signaling devices designed to be heard across distance. One-sentence teaser. Miniature clay resonators produce tones that could encode signals, part acoustic instrument, part communication technology, suggesting soundscaping as a means of information transmission. Acoustic analysis of reconstructed cylinders shows characteristic resonant frequencies that are stable and replicable. When arrays of these cylinders are tuned and played in specific sequences, patterns emerge that could be analogous to code. Ethnographic parallels exist in later cultures that used coded horn blasts and drum patterns to transmit messages across valleys. But here the device's small size implies a different principle, perhaps a language of pitch sequences rather than volume and rhythm. Now, let's be fair, sound degrades and context is everything. Without a performance tradition, devices can be misread. Yet, for all the evidence, the presence of arrays in formal settings, paired with carved motifs suggesting mnemonic association between pitch and message, supports the idea of deliberate acoustic coding. Competing theories range from musical toys used in ritual play to tools of short-range signaling in market environments or defensive perimeters. A more speculative possibility imagines an acoustic literacy, communities encoding knowledge not only in marks and numbers but in sequences of sound that apprentices learn to decode. Picture yourself seated in a cool shade, listening as children run a phrase of tuned cylinders through fingers and call across the plain, the message carrying like a folded letter in the air. Think about the human desire to compress information into modulated waves and how sound, invisible and immediate, might have anchored social coordination long before the written word reached every hand. We still don't know whether this acoustic encoding was a fleeting experiment, a long-lived tradition, or a regional communication system whose rules we can only approximate. In a swampy delta where reeds sway like a sea of hands, divers found an extraordinary cache of organic materials, ropes, plaited fabrics, and boats sealed in peat, that preserve dyes and fibers pointing to a textile technology of exceptional nuance. One-sentence teaser. Waterlogged textiles show dyeing techniques and fiber blends that amount to a textile science, stable color-fast dyes and composite weaves implying deep botanical and technical knowledge. Chemical analysis reveals mordants and dye compounds derived from plants that are geographically distant, suggesting trade in raw materials or knowledge of extraction techniques from afar. Weavers used complex twining patterns and composite fibers, linen blended with bast fibers and animal hair, yielding cloths that balance warmth and breathability in equal measure. Pigments include mineral and organic sources fixed with tannins and processes that resist fading even after centuries in peat. Now, scholars debate whether such textile sophistication was the preserve of elite manufacture or a widespread domestic craft with knowledge transmitted across households. The broader implication is clear: textiles carry more than warmth, they encode trade routes, botanical knowledge, and social signaling. A more audacious interpretation sees textiles as a vector of technological and aesthetic norms, their patterns and dye recipes moving like mimetic cargo along the same corridors that carried metal and ceramic. Picture yourself touching a recovered scarf, the fibers softened by time yet still patterned, imagining a weaver blending threads as carefully as a chemist blends reagents, selecting plant baths by season, noting which ashes bright and which hues, an embodied knowledge transmitted from hand to hand. We still don't know how standardized textile knowledge was, how it moved across languages and borders, or the social mechanisms that protected or diffused such craft secrets. There are valleys where the ground yields not objects but equations, loci of carved stone and buried markers that resolve into landscape-scale alignments mapping seasonal resources, migration corridors, and territorial divisions with the clarity of a cadastral plan. One-sentence teaser. Markings and markers across a valley form a functional territorial script, an early form of landscape writing that encodes resource management and social boundaries. Survey teams noted repeated geometries, sidelines from high points to markers that align with locations of springs, grazing lands, and seasonal shelters, mid-valley stelae that demarcate access rights, and hearth alignments that correlate with herd movement patterns. This is not merely a symbolic claim to land. The network functions practically, allowing communities to coordinate resource use, reduce conflict, and maintain ecological resilience. Now, let's be fair, interpreting markers as legal or administrative is a heavy lift without corroborating texts or legal artifacts. Yet for all the evidence, the repeatability, standardization, and relational logic of these markers suggest a communal infrastructure of governance expressed in stone rather than in parchment. Competing theories include ritual landscape practice wherein sacred markers coincidentally double as property indicators, or a distributed governance model where knowledge of markers and rights circulated orally and through ceremony. A bold possibility frames these systems as proto-bureaucracies, durable, low-tech record-keeping embedded in the environment itself, legible to those trained in the local code. Picture yourself hiking a ridge and recognizing the significance of a particular cairn not as trivia but as a map that organizes where your children will graze animals next season. Imagine how such landscape literacy shapes daily life and long-term planning. We still don't know to what extent such systems scaled, whether they interfaced with written law elsewhere, or how conflicts over interpretation were adjudicated without a centralized judiciary. As these additional scenes accumulate, a drowned plan of streets, botanical laboratories of resin and seed, portable observatories beside a lake, tuned clay cylinders singing across plains, peat-preserved textiles with far-reaching color recipes, and carved markers that order a valley, we begin to sense not random strangeness but recurring strategies. People across time and space confronted common problems: how to mark time, how to move goods, how to heal bodies, how to organize attention in a world of scarce resources, how to transmit knowledge in ways resilient to loss. Sometimes solutions converged, sometimes an innovation in one valley burst like a lantern, casting light that others picked up. Sometimes practices remained stubbornly local, brilliant sparks that died out when social or environmental conditions shifted. The archaeological record is not a monolith but a chorus, its fragments singing variants of the same themes. We still don't know the full score, but the melody threads through human life, the practical mingled with the ritual, the experimental with the habitual. We started with a promise, to walk the thin, uncanny line where fact flirts with wonder and to treat both with equal seriousness. Now, as we draw these threads together, let's hold close the images you've already carried with you: the harbor whose stones remember ships no textbook expected, the plateau that counts the slow tilt of the heavens, the galleries cut to manage water as if time itself were a resource to be engineered, the desert fragments that gleam with alloyed mysteries, the submerged rooms whose etched lines might be an early script, the barrows that make us ask whether human bodies always fit the boxes we build for them, the kiln that captured light and glass, the little jars that might have bottled small electric miracles, the lattices under a humming hill, islands where pottery languages mingle like peoples, marsh workshops that spin wooden motion into labor-saving thought, valley mines that shape politics and trade, caves where pattern and number move like a single melody, drowned street plans, botanical basins like early laboratories, portable starboards for itinerant sky watchers, resonant clay cylinders that made coded sound, peat-preserved textiles holding recipes and trade routes, and carved markers that order a valley like a living map. Each of these places, in its own weather and soil and silence, asked us to do something difficult and generous, to take fragments seriously while remaining willing to be proved wrong. That double posture, rigor and humility, is the heart of the work. It is also how we begin to read a much larger story. What binds these discoveries is not a single revolutionary engine but a constellation of human motives and constraints. First, necessity and environment. Communities everywhere responded to climate swings, resource scarcity, and the pressures of mobility in ways that favored invention. Water drives canals and galleries. Wind and sea demand harbors and way stations. Marginal soils push people toward terraces and hydraulic thinking. When survival is precarious, the pace of innovation accelerates, and ingenuity that might otherwise simmer for generations finds its outlet in bold experiments. Second, the social value of novelty. Craftspeople who could gild cheaply, who could fashion brighter glass, who could extract metal more cleanly, or who could predict seasonal flood lines brought prestige and leverage to themselves and their patrons. Prestige economies, ritual display, and the need to secure allegiance all create incentives to invest in technologies, even if those investments do not immediately scale into state-level systems. Third, networks, both obvious and hidden, are crucial. We keep discovering that ideas traveled not only on imperial roads and state ships but along thin threads. A smith who married a merchant's daughter, an itinerant priest who taught calendar tricks for a season, an island family who kept caches for passing crews. These braided currents, trade, marriage, ritual teaching, itinerant craftsmen, are less visible in the archival silence but every bit as real as the grand caravans we picture on maps. Fourth, memory. Whether encoded in stone sidelines, oral narrative, ritual objects, or portable boards, communities found durable ways to pass information across generations. The persistence of certain myths aligned with material correlates, buried estuaries, stones that point to the solstice, songs that map reef hazards, shows that oral culture can preserve highly practical knowledge, not just fuzzy legend. Finally, serendipity and failure are part of the story. Many brilliant experiments produced no long arc of transmission. They flickered and died. The archaeological record is full of sparks that did not catch. That is not a failure of ancient people. It is the same pattern that animates human creativity today. If we adopt this broader view, several deeper implications emerge. One is chronological humility. The past has a stubborn way of outpacing our neat periodizations. When a harbor predates our assumptions, or a kiln produces glass of astonishing purity, the tidy ladder of progress flattens into a landscape of islands, some connected, some not, where brilliance can arise early, in pockets, and under local conditions. Another implication is epistemic pluralism. Knowledge takes many forms. Not all useful knowledge looks like a treatise or a blueprint. A weaver's dye recipe transmitted mouth to hand is as consequential as a state edict. A pattern in cave art can encode cycles as surely as an astronomical table. To understand ancient competence, we must broaden what counts as evidence and listen to the quieter media. The smell of resins on a shard, the grain in a hardened mortar, the growth rings in a plank that tell us the precise year a shaft was cut. A third implication concerns resilience. Studies of past infrastructural choices, terraces, roads, ports, galleries, offer lessons for modern communities facing climate stress. They show us pragmatic adaptations, negotiated labor systems, and the political will required to marshal communal effort. They also illustrate failure modes. When networks collapse, knowledge can be lost. Crafts can vanish if livelihoods vanish. Finally, there is a moral implication about humility in our storytelling. We have a habit of making the past a stage for our linear triumphal narratives. Civilization marches forward, technologies accumulate, we become modern. But the material record insists on complexity. Rise is punctuated by decline, innovation by oblivion, and brilliance by local limitation. It calls us to narrate the past as a chorus of experiments rather than a single trope of progress. You and I, as readers and listeners, bring our own frames. Some will prefer conservative readings, contamination, misdating, later intrusion, and the scientific method requires those checks. Skepticism is not only reasonable, it's necessary. Yet skepticism without imaginative engagement risks missing the point. Each object and alignment invites hypothesis and experiment. The jars that produce a tiny current can be replicated, The megalith site lines can be surveyed against precession models, the alloy signatures can be compared across wider geographies, and the oral tales can be mapped to submerged topography. Science wins not by killing wonder but by testing it, by attempting replication, and by allowing the data to shift our models. When multiple lines of independent evidence converge, dating, context, residue analysis, where patterns, isotopic signatures, the likelihood of a genuine anomaly grows and our obligation to explain it increases too. There is also an ethical dimension here. These sites are not only data points, they are graves, workshops, homes, settings where people lived, loved, feared, and died. When we excavate, we enter that life world. Respect matters, careful stratigraphic digging, collaboration with descendant communities where possible, and transparent reporting are not academic niceties but moral responsibilities. Too often the race for sensational headlines has flattened nuance. Giants, or ancient electricity, can become clickbait that obscures the patient scholarly labor behind the claim. We must be vigilant against that temptation because sensational claims can also fuel cultural appropriation, looting, and the distortion of community histories. The best work ties deep analysis to ethical stewardship, and it tells stories that are joyous precisely because they value evidence and the human beings those facts represent. So what should we do, given these tangled, luminous fragments? First, cultivate curiosity that is disciplined, read reports, follow replication studies, and treat outlier findings neither as curiosities to be cheered blindly nor as embarrassments to be ignored. Second, support interdisciplinary approaches. Archaeologists, metallurgists, geomorphologists, ethnohistorians, and local knowledge holders working together yield richer pictures than researchers isolated by discipline. Third, care about conservation. Drowned sites facing rising seas and peat-preserved textiles vulnerable to exposure are fragile. Time matters. Fourth, broaden education. If students learn not only imperial dynasties but also the mechanics of craft, the chemistry of dyes, and the practical math of megalith builders, our appreciation for past ingenuity would deepen. And finally, when you feel the tug of wonder, when you see a photograph or a short documentary that seems too beautiful to be true, reserve a portion of your awe for the method that will separate what's plausible from what's not. Wonder is our engine, evidence is our steering wheel. What I hope you take from this long walk is not a list of mysteries waiting for dramatic resolutions, but a richer sense of human possibility. The past is porous. Ideas move not only by force but by marriage, song, trade, curiosity, and the intimate labor of hands. The artifacts we prize are the fossilized fingerprints of people who were as inventive, as petty, as ambitious, and as tender as we are. The harbor builder who counted low tides had the same basic anxieties as a modern city planner. The enamel glazing artisan who found a shortcut to gold tones knew the same thrill of craft as the contemporary jeweler. The itinerant sky watcher who rotated a portable board to catch a star's shadow was trying, like you or me, to make sense of seasons and to anchor a community's life to something larger than themselves. In the end, the value of these discoveries is not merely empirical, it is existential. They complicate our comfortable narratives and they reconnect us, across millennia, to the small, persistent habits that make civilizations possible. The shared meal, the traded bead, the repaired roof, the apprentice who learns by watching a master's hands. They remind us that progress is not the monopoly of a few epochs but a mosaic made of countless local choices. They teach humility, because sometimes our sharpest models bluntly miss the past's messier ingenuity. And they offer hope, because if people once solved hard problems with modest tools and fierce cooperation, perhaps we can do the same for the urgent challenges we now face. So keep the image that began our journey, the fog-clinging estuary where a carved mooring stone emerges like a punctuation mark in a sentence we are only beginning to read. Keep the plateau where stones frame the solstice as if time were a public performance. Keep the clay jar, blackened with residues that hint at simple chemistry and surprising reach. Let the memory of these places prod you to look twice at a shard, to ask who made it, and why, and to listen for the quiet persistence of human creativity. Remember, the past is not out there as a museum of curiosities. It is beneath our feet, folded into the ground and the water, waiting for careful hands to reveal it. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.